Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's May 4, 2020. Today, we're speaking with Tom Kean and Ben Dunant, two journalists employed by Frontier Myanmar, an English language publication and subscription media service that everyone listening to this podcast should really check out. Hello, Tom and Ben.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Luke. Hope you're doing well.
I am, and the same to the both of you. Yesterday was World Press Freedom Day, and today we are recording the fourth of our annual series of updates on press freedom in Myanmar, which just so happens to be taking place during this uncertain period of COVID-19 effects and measures. So this will also be something like our Myanmar Musings de facto COVID-19 podcast. So we've seen a reduction in print media publications year on year since the busy period of growth that followed the Press Scrutiny and Registration Department relaxing its censorship in 2012. So since 2016, when I started this podcast, there's been this steady decrease in domestic media organisations, particularly print, publishing Myanmar news. And we've discussed before that much of this is down to natural business pressures in a changing technological context and the public's move to Facebook. So have we seen this trend continue in the last year? And how has COVID-19 affected the business and diversity of the media landscape?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I feel like we always start at this point, and as it's become an annual thing to do this podcast, it's a natural starting point. We have seen a continued decline in sort of the mainstream traditional media organizations that Myanmar had that developed under the military government, since around 2000. Probably since 2015, 2016, shortly after we started doing this podcast, advertising revenue started to decline in Myanmar as Facebook became more popular, and it was also just following the global trend. But it's happened in this incredibly short period of time. You've gone from having media organizations that were doing quite well from advertising to having almost no advertising. And COVID-19 is kind of like the final nail in the coffin. I mean, whatever advertising was left has really just disappeared now. And I think we'll see some media organizations kind of on their last legs unless they can really pivot their business model. One of the things we have seen over the past year is that more media organizations are thinking about different business models, moving away from advertising-based revenue model to try and generate more revenue from readers. I'd say Frontier's kind of been at the forefront of this. We launched a membership model, but we've seen other publications, other media organizations look at reader-based revenue models as well in different ways. Myanmar launched one which was more like a donation model. 7 Days had a subscription model for like a news stream service. I don't think that they've been particularly successful so far. I think, the Frontier one has, I can say from our perspective, has been quite successful, but it's on quite a small scale as well. And the thing about that is it works for Frontier, but the model won't necessarily work for other media organizations. And I think, media organizations are also looking at grants where they're available. That's probably the other kind of option, when advertising starts to disappear.
What I'd add to that to say is that I think a lot of these trends are particularly unfortunate here in this country, Myanmar, because independent media was not really given much of a chance to grow before 2012 and the lifting of pre-publication censorship. Some independent media, but it had to operate under very heavy constraints. There was a pretty old school form of pre-publication censorship. So, the kind of independent freewheeling media that we'd recognize in most of the free world, relatively new phenomenon, and that was only just taking off. And there was only really a few short years in which they could, rely on advertising revenue, rely on the big readership. But this was very quickly and rather crudely kind of cut short by the mass adoption of social media and the trends that you're seeing in the rest of the world.
Right. So, we're recording this podcast at an unprecedented time. It's a global pandemic. COVID-19 is causing huge number of effects we can't even get into here. But one thing is for sure, it's a time when information is critical, when government transparency is crucial, messaging is important, quality media reportage is, I would say, mandatory. So how is we can say the NLD government first and maybe the Tatmadaw second, been communicating with the public during this time, and how's the media reacting to and reporting on COVID-19 in Myanmar?
Around the world, there has been some commentary about how governments are using COVID-19 to restrict media freedom. I don't really think that that's been a situation that we've seen in Myanmar. And similarly, I think the NLD government, by its standards, has been reasonably transparent. The Ministry of Health and Sports has been putting out quite regular information about, what's going on, the number of cases, testing, this kind of thing. So Aung San Suu Kyi is speaking every day to different people involved in the COVID response effort, and those conversations are being shared through the television, through social media, and so on. So there is a lot of information available about what the government is doing and what its policies are, but journalists tend not to have great access to government officials still. It's still quite difficult to get comments from the Ministry of Health and Sports. It's hard to interview ordinary doctors and nurses and other kind of medical professionals. They're often quite reluctant to speak to the media. Just a recent example, one of our reporters was working on a feature about Weibagi Infectious Diseases Hospital in Yangon, which has sort of been the main hospital for isolating COVID-19 patients and he had a lot of difficulty because the head of the hospital had made clear to staff that they were not allowed to talk to the media. She was the only one who is allowed to talk to the media, but she doesn't want to talk to the media. So that's kind of a pretty common attitude, I think, particularly kind of at the upper levels of the Ministry of Health. I mean, I think lower down health officials are willing to talk. It's often that they feel like they're not able to because of the policy of their superiors. So we have to kind of be, a bit creative. My colleagues were able to do quite a good article about the response in Rakhine State by interviewing ordinary doctors on the ground, and they were able to get some pretty insightful material from them. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there's a lot of information coming out from the government, but still access for journalists, to ask the questions that they want to ask is not great, but it's not worse than it normally is in Myanmar. You're facing the same sort of reluctance that you often get.
Yeah, and I would agree with that entirely. And I think the flow of information from the government has been unprecedented in many ways. On the website of the Ministry of Health, there is this portal with a surprising amount of information. There are situation reports that detail the cases and their relationship with other confirmed cases. It's definitely given journalists and other civil society people a lot more to work with in terms of sort of coming up with creative approaches to stories. So that's been quite welcome. But as Thomas says, getting access, the ability to challenge or directly question high-level officials on their policies and, to get them to answer to mistakes or questionable decisions is still as hard as it ever was. And that's not a surprise. I mean, I know that there was some concern that the government could be very handed in enforcing its line. It was at the beginning, the government was, warning against fake news and that set off alarm bells because that suggested that the government may want to lash out at migrant organizations that are sending different messages about COVID that would contradict government policies. Fortunately, we've not seen that. The punitive actions so far have been directed at people and individuals who've been violating quarantine and curfew measures and so on. So
just to add to that, I mean, there was this narrative about the government being in denial as well, about the presence of COVID-19 in Myanmar, because Myanmar was one of the last countries to record a confirmed case. And there was this kind of narrative that the government was denying or maybe even covering up cases in Myanmar. I mean, that was pretty overblown, and I think probably didn't really help the relationship between the government and journalists. Like, there was one example where Dorsu had been quoted in international media as saying, like, COVID-19 is not in Myanmar. But if you look at what she actually, this was in English, if you look at what she actually said in Burmese, she was saying, like, we haven't found it yet. But when it got translated into English somehow, it became, it's not here. And that's obviously a very different thing. If you say, you know, Matwaya Deu, like, we haven't seen it yet, you're not saying that it's not here. So, you know, that was a thing. You know, there was this narrative about the government being in denial that I think was really kind of overblown, and there's nothing wrong with holding the government accountable, but, like, it did seem to be that the Myanmar government has got a lot of criticism over the last couple of years, and it just seemed to be a bit of a continuation of that, like trying to find fault with everything they were doing. You know, you can criticize the lack of testing and stuff like that, but some of the statements from government officials weren't as kind of black and white as they were presented. The other thing was the difficulty accessing government officials. I think there was kind of an interesting example of this. There was a press conference on the 22nd of April to unveil this new facility that the Yangon region government has created to treat COVID patients on the outskirts of Yangon, because the two hospitals that accept patients at the moment are filling up quite rapidly. So it was a ceremony and a press conference to talk about this facility at Pongji, but none of the journalists asked about the facility. They asked about other things because they, you know, related to COVID, because they just haven't had the opportunity to ask government officials. The Ministry of Health and Sports spokesperson just doesn't answer the phone, and he was there that day. So it was a chance to ask about the situation in Rakhine and all sorts of other things. But no one asked about the actual facility, right? They were just taking this opportunity while they had it. So, you know, I think that just underlines the difficulty that journalists have in getting comments from government officials.
From reading Frontier's coverage of COVID-19 in Myanmar, I myself left the country a few weeks ago. It seems that the government is still drawing a huge number of links to Christian gathering and foreign transmission, not community transmission. That seems to be the two themes of the messaging of the NLD. So what do you two think? Firstly, is that characterization fair? And secondly, as journalists and as long-term residents of Myanmar, what do you think about if not the truth of what the government is saying about COVID-19, then perhaps the massaging of the message in order to downplay panic?
Okay, well, what I'd say to that is I think that there's been quite a slow, gradual, but quite definite improvement in the government and the health ministry ability to track down cases. You know, at the moment, it's in a totally different place to like where it was a month ago, when really they were very slow to get going. Some of it was like fairly bungling, but sort of week by week, the response has been improving a lot. And I mean, I think progress has been way too slow. For instance, actual testing for the virus is still just confined to Yangon. And they've been talking for ages about using another lab in Mandalay, but they've been talking about this for 2 months now. And with the urgency of the crisis, like certain aspects of the response just sort of are taking a long time and are really taking far too long. So it's still quite slow and pretty clunky, I think, compared to many other countries. So it's still hard to know the actual picture. I mean, I don't, like as Tom said, I think it's very unlikely that anything is really being covered up. The reality is that we are not at the moment, or at least not yet, in the grip of mass community spread. because we would see the results of that regardless of how many people are being tested.
I think the government's messaging on this has evolved a bit. And I think there's an acknowledgement now that, I mean, they're finding cases that are isolated. I mean, they don't know how, they can't work out how the person was infected. I mean, they're doing contact tracing and not finding any contacts that have COVID. So, they're not really shying away from that. I mean, they're not trying to hide the information. I mean, it's all there in the situation reports. I think, as Ben said, the contact tracing has been quite good. This was something the WHO highlighted, and I had a conversation with a person the other day. Actually, they were talking about how one of their staff was on a flight, one leg of a flight, next to someone who a few days later tested positive, and they managed to track her down. And we're quite impressed at the thoroughness of the contact tracing. And I think, that is an area where Myanmar kind of has the resources to do a good job, but there are other areas where it was just, it's been caught completely flat-footed. I mean, it had nowhere near the testing capacity it needed. And, you look at some of the work that's being done to increase ICU capacity, because intensive care units are needed for very serious cases. I mean, the country has 200 ICU beds. I mean, it's completely unprepared. Its health system is going to need a lot of work. And I think, one of the good things about COVID in Myanmar, and I think we can say at this point, one of the good things, it doesn't seem that we're seeing this massive spike in cases, but there's definitely a lot of movement on the government side to improve preparedness for a potential spike, and also for the emergence of other respiratory diseases. And it's not happening as fast as it should, I agree, but it is happening, and, the health system will be left in a much better position at the end of this, I think.
Okay, great. The government has been talking about testing in Mandalay for 2 months, you said earlier. Now, you've also said that it's not possible to easily ask questions of the minister or other people about, what that means or why that is, or any of the sorts of normal questions that you would ask. If journalists can't ask those questions, is that translating into a discussion in the public sphere or in the media on the policies being enacted? Have there been any opinion columns, loud debates, voices, constructively or not, debating the government's response to this?
It's a multifaceted challenge, right? I mean, you've got the health response, you've got the economic response, you've also got the kind of the security aspects of it, or the prevention measures that are being undertaken. They're designed to prevent the spread of COVID-19, but they have much broader implications, right? People's ability to move around freely, their ability to earn income and so on. And I think the pure kind of health response side, I haven't seen much of an informed debate. But I think on the other aspects, things like, should Myanmar have introduced a lockdown, like a hard lockdown, like in India? There was quite a lot of debate in certain circles. I don't know if the government responded to that, but they did move away from the suggestion of a lockdown. And I suspect that the discussion that was being held that was taking place among people who can influence policy, I think probably did have some impact on that and was really positive. And I think there's also a lot of discussion about economic policy and the economic response as well. I think those are the areas that people are more discussing, rather than the extent of testing and improvements of the health system to cope with severe cases and things like that. I don't think that's really a discussion that's taking place very much in the kind of public domain, in the media.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that is, notwithstanding opinion pieces or the angle of articles, is you do get a lot of critical voices in civil society that are then quoted and find their way into articles. And one is that with this nationwide infrastructure of quarantine centers that are, that over the last month or so have been set up in villages and towns, turning migrant workers from Thailand and China, or sometimes people traveling internally, or people who've made known contact with confirmed cases. Often repurposed schools because schools are closed. And while these have been set up and there's now a fairly robust system of quarantine centers, the burden for that falls pretty heavily on communities. It's often local communities and volunteers that have the people in the quarantine centers. For a poor rural village, this is a very big burden, particularly considering that the official quarantine period has been changed from 2 to 3 weeks. And a lot of these local groups that are helping to run these quarantine centers in the local high school, are often really kind of struggling, and they're feeling that they're not getting a lot of support from the government. So there's some kind of angst there that, a lot of communities feel that they have to shoulder the burden themselves without a lot of government help. And that's been sort of finding its way into the media.
And at the same time as all of this is going on, there continues to be waves of arrests of journalists in Myanmar connected to Rakhine State, which has had an internet blackout restricting citizens from, accessing independent information about the virus and anything else. Who's been arrested and why, and what's troubling about these arrests of journalists?
Yeah, so the arrests that we've seen most recently have been related to coverage of the Rakhine State conflict. That's the conflict between the Arakan Army and the Tatmadaw. It really stems from the government's decision to designate the Arakan Army as a terrorist organization and an unlawful association. But the terrorist organization designation is more significant here. And in the wake of that, they arrested several journalists that had recently interviewed the Arakan Army leadership, either the leader or spokespeople. And what we're seeing is just an attempt to completely deplatform the Arakan Army as much as possible. So they've already been kicked off Facebook I think it was last month or in March. In April, sorry. The mobile operators were ordered to block access to Arakan Army website and to certain Rakhine news websites. This is sort of a continuation of that. It's an attempt to get the Arakan Army out of sort of independent media as well. And obviously it's concerning. I mean, that leaves journalists to, I suppose, their reporting automatically becomes one-sided because they can't include the statements from the Arakan Army or interview the Arakan Army. The other source of information on actual fighting is the Tatmadaw. And I think that most journalists feel like they can't trust what the Tatmadaw says. I mean, I was just reading an RFA report today about there were allegations that the Tatmadaw had bombed and then torched some villages in Rakhine State, and it had denied this. The article was pointing out, well, if the Tatmadaw denied it, why did the Rakhine State government pay compensation to the homes that were destroyed? The Tatmadaw had said, we went there and everything was intact. So it's just not a reliable source of information. I mean, this is a conflict and you can't just trust what the Tatmadaw says. But because of this use of the counterterrorism law, it's very dangerous for journalists or other researchers to contact the Arakan Army or to quote them in their work. It will be interesting to see how the Arakan Army responds to that, whether they kind of have develop proxies to speak for them on their behalf. I think journalists are relying more on, for example, parliamentarians for information. So it will be. I don't think the government can control the narrative completely, but it's really just to scare journalists off from reporting on the conflict.
The recent attacks on journalism, this punishing and going after people who are having interviews with the Arakan Army. I mean, this is one of the most serious attacks on press freedom that we've seen in the last 5 years, really. It's just being rather buried in his agenda because of the pandemic. And it shows a Tatmadaw that is particularly unrestrained and quite bogged down in a particular conflict with an ethnic group, which is humiliating it fairly successfully. The Tatmadaws pursued a very ruthless military solution to this conflict, and has just ended up getting incredibly bogged down in Rakhine State. And at the same time, has come to view this conflict with the Arakan Army very much, or at least partly, as an information war. The Arakan Army, with its younger leadership, has been quite tech and social media savvy. It's used social media and the internet to gain a very passionate following among the Rakhine diaspora elsewhere in Myanmar or elsewhere in the region, and has been able to kind of cultivate links with, get its view across very easily. And I think the Tatmadaw, who's generally been quite kind of media shy, has really changed its approach to PR and psychological warfare. There was a change about a year ago, or maybe earlier, when the Tatmadaw True News Department, which would normally be a department was very difficult to contact, would just sort of release these statements and not respond to any comments, is suddenly answering reporters' phone calls, is in press conferences, and is much more aggressively trying to control the media narrative.
Has been said, just as these attacks on press freedom haven't got the attention that they deserve, neither has the conflict. I think for a lot of people, Myanmar has many ethnic conflicts, ethnic armed conflicts, the KIO and the KNU, for a long time, Shan groups, the Wa, and so on. And it's kind of easy to see this as just another conflict, but it's not. This is the heaviest fighting that Myanmar's seen for decades. And increasingly, there's a very high civilian toll that we probably haven't seen in other areas for a long time. The Tatmadaw is increasingly using air power and artillery, and it's a very sort of indiscriminate way to fight a war when there's lots of civilians around. And so since the start of the year, it seems like, based on public sources, probably around 100 civilians have been killed, which by the context of armed conflict in Myanmar is a lot. It's just seems to be seen as just another conflict, but it's not. We're moving constantly in the direction of escalation, and the designation of the Arakan Army as a terrorist group is just another step in that direction. It narrows the options for a negotiated solution, and I think it's just so deeply concerning. And it does get very little attention, really. It's quite surprising.
So just in the last few days, a free speech advocacy group at Dunant released a report. According to their data, there have been at least 539 lawsuits against 1,051 individuals for expressing themselves in the last 4 years. Now, some of this, one assumes, were against journalists or media organizations. So there's supposed to be an election later this year, marking the end of the NLD's first term of government. What are your two individual report cards on this administration's understanding and treatment of Myanmar public's freedom of speech and the media and foreign media? And maybe you could indulge in a comparison with the USDP's previous term of government.
I can start. I'd say that the USDP government had these landmark reforms and these very profound changes in the role and the independence of the media. A lot of that was low-hanging fruit. So I'm sure it's a very fair comparison. You can only abolish pre-publication censorship once, and that was also a more fortuitous time for media organizations, as we discussed, and ad revenue was better and so on. But at the same time, the attitude of the government is fairly different. The UCP government had a credibility problem. It came to power in an election that didn't have much credibility at all. It was this party of former generals. And so it felt the need kind of court journalists. It felt it had something to prove. The NLD government doesn't feel that it needs to have anything to prove. It won the landslide election. It's a hugely popular party. So the government hasn't felt like it's needed anything to prove, and it's had a wary relationship with the media. So I think that's led to a very low priority to the media development and media freedom. That has just resulted in, very reform, very little improvement, and increase of arrests. I mean, that Athan profiled, a lot of them were under a defamation clause under the telecommunication law that was used as people were becoming more familiar with the law. A lot of these suits require the permission of the communications ministry to actually go ahead. The government has gave them their blessing. So I think that attitude to the media has just been very demoralizing.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think that the telecommunications law is a good example. What I found interesting is there was a public campaign to change the law. It got a bit of traction, and the NLD did introduce some amendments. They were mostly tinkering at the edges, like reducing the sentence from 3 years to 2 years. But in the wake of that, they haven't really used it as much. And instead, the law that is now being widely used is the law protecting the privacy and security of citizens. And that's been responsible for, or that's been used to prosecute, I think, several hundred people. And that really hasn't got much attention. I think that says a lot about the way that many people in Myanmar view freedom of speech, in that it's not this kind of fundamental right necessarily. It's a right that is conditional, and it comes with responsibilities. And as soon as you overstep the mark, then it's okay to put you in prison for a few years, or at least put you on trial. So that definitely has kind of crept up on us, I think, at Frontier as well. The use of this particular law, I was really taken aback when I saw the Athan numbers, and I think that kind of highlights the importance of having groups like Athan that keep track of these things. When we talk about the government's relationship with the media, I also have to think about the government's attitude towards freedom of expression, because they're kind of two different things. I think, like as Ben said, the USCP had a sort of a political need to engage with the media and to have good relationships. And so although a lot of these laws were on the books, they refrained from using them against journalists for the most part. Nearly all the cases against journalists under the USCP government were actually brought by the military rather than the kind of semi-civilian government. But the NLD hasn't needed to do that. So we have seen the NLD and both the party, individuals in the party and the government pursue cases against journalists, and also just generally not be particularly open with the media, and, not being comfortable dealing with the media. But I think beyond that, there is this kind of bigger issue with the NLD over freedom of expression. It's just not a priority for them. And also that I think they still kind of have this mindset where they're still engaged in a war, really. They're still engaged in a battle with the military for control of the country, and they can use that to justify a lot of things that go against the sort of the values that they claim to espouse. I think if you ask a lot of NLD people, they will say, like, yes, freedom of speech is important, but they will be able to justify the use of these laws to prosecute people for saying things that they think are out of line and are undermining their kind of their revolution, like their attempt to get the military out of politics. So I think, two issues: the relationship with the media and the NLD's kind of position on freedom of expression or freedom of speech.
At the end of every episode, we ask the guests for recommendations to do with Myanmar. You've both been on the show before, so you know how it works. But of course, these are strange times. I don't know how much extra time the two of you are spending in your homes, so whether this recommendation can qualify as a quarantine or a self-isolation recommendation. But let's hear what you've got for us. Start with you, Ben.
Yeah, I think that, as we were discussing earlier, the onset of COVID is really the nail in the coffin, at least in media, for ad-based media. So I think the next few years are going to be critical in terms of whether these new models that media organizations are pioneering, including Frontier, that are based on memberships or subscriptions and getting revenue from readers, the next couple of years are going to be critical as to whether they succeed. So I think it's very important for anyone who values media to get in the habit of subscriptions, becoming members to the media that they like. That's my recommendation. A little bit self-serving perhaps, but I think it's in service of a more important cause.
Thanks for that, Ben. I'm glad that you took one for the team and recommended that. And I'll for my recommendations, there you go, recommendations. I've actually got two. One's Myanmar related. So I would recommend reading and keeping an eye on the Independent Rakhine Initiative. I just came across their report on freedom of movement in Rakhine State and found it super informative. I actually don't know much about the Independent Rakhine Initiative, and they don't seem to have a website, but I hope that they continue to put out more informative information about the situation on the ground there, because it's not, at the moment, access is almost impossible, but generally access is difficult, and understanding what is going on is on the ground is really important. For a kind of COVID lockdown or social distancing recommendation, I'd recommend reading Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. It's probably long enough to get you through the whole pandemic, but I've just been reading it the last few days, and it's great and highly recommended. I've had it on my bookshelf for more than 10 years, so I'm glad I got this opportunity to finally dive into it.
So 3 excellent recommendations there: the Independent Rakhine Initiative, Life and Fate, and subscribe to Frontier Myanmar.
Subscribe to the independent media organizations that you value. It was a bit more open-ended than that, but definitely subscribe to Frontier. Yeah.
So subscribing to Frontier Myanmar was my spin. Right. Thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musing, Tom.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Ben.
Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me back.